Well, first of all, that was incredibly inspiring. And as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about training and capability development in our own sector, the work that you've been doing and the results that you've shown are really amazing, especially within a one-year time frame. So I look forward actually to hearing much more. I wish it was a 30-minute talk. Thanks for that. So I'd like to just spend some time talking about what we've learned and what we're seeing in the GCC in terms of the entrepreneurial and kind of startup environment. I'll try to focus on a couple of points that weren't covered by my colleagues like Osama yesterday, and maybe Nabil will take a different perspective on the same question. But it is a topic that's quite in vogue and talked about quite a bit, and something that we've been spending the last 5 years developing as AstroLabs. I'll give you a little bit of context about myself and what we do before jumping into the content. Post founding and working at a scaling technology company, Nemshi, in e-commerce in between 2011 and 13, one of my partners and myself, Louis and I, decided to start a platform to enable entrepreneurship and to support entrepreneurship in the region, and somehow to be at the center of this upcoming wave of technology coming to the region. And so we started actually along the lines of the fact that there wasn't very good quality training and, let's say, skills development for founders and for people who really wanted to be in this whole space. So we developed, based on some of our personal experience, some content that we took around the region. So everything from Egypt to Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi. So for back in 2013, we were training in Riyadh and Jeddah, and we were even in, I think, 14 in Al-Khura at Mecca Techno Valley. So we had an opportunity to see about 100 and 150 different technology companies around the MENA region and train and work with their founders. And that led to then also layering on top of that community. So we built co-working space in Dubai, and now we have two that are in Dubai, about 120 startups from all over the world that are there. And just recently, we soft launched actually in Riyadh. So we have a space in Melga in North Riyadh that we just opened up and are exploring that market as well. So it's a little bit of context about who I am and what we do. I'll talk to you a little bit about sort of what I'm seeing and what are some of the trends in the investment landscape which has been evolving since even that 2013 time frame, which is when a lot of things kind of started to pick up. A lot of the data points that I'll mention are actually from the State of Digital Investments in MENA report that came out, published by ArabNet, which you can refer back to for some more depth and a lot of more data points. But it has been interesting to see an upward trend in terms of investment. There is incremental growth. I would say that our topic is the GCC, and interestingly enough, the lion's share of everything from the number of investors, which is about 50% of venture investors in the region, in the MENA region, are between the UAE and KSA. In terms of the value of investing, the vast majority is actually between these couple of markets. What we've seen in if you look at some of the numbers that are quite interesting, so we'll look back at 2017 as a full year. About 40% of the deals overall in the region happened between the UAE and Saudi, but almost 80%, about 77% of the value, so the amount of money invested, were between these two places, right? So there has been growth throughout the region, but it's kind of most so, and within that, it's mostly the UAE. A lot of that growth is also driven by these spikes that you see are driven by a few deals, right? So you might be able to think of them. Kareem, right? There's been the Souk deal. There's been a Stars Play Arabia deal that happened between 2016 and 17 that actually represent the lion's share of that growth. So a cynic can look at it and say, listen, actually the growth in terms of amount of investment, if you just take out those deals, is actually not that much. It's kind of very incrementally growing. And it's still very much an early stage ecosystem, and even the VCs are having a hard time raising follow-on funding for raising follow-on rounds and funds. Sorry. The established ones. And that's one of the challenges it's faced is the amount of investment capital that is available and that's being deployed within the ecosystem, right? So, but we are seeing a growth. We just, the concentration within the UAE that you see is actually not representative of the actual companies. I think the reason why there's so many in the UAE is that a lot of the successful companies from an Egypt or a Lebanon or a Jordan or other places will actually expand to the UAE and raise money there. So it's not that they were all just born there, right? Which is something important to keep in mind. So it's a little bit about what's happening in the market. Overall numbers, there has been, if you look at the UAE, it was like $36 million dollars of investment back in 2013, and it went up to about $465 million in 2017. And then, so there has been kind of a growth overall, both in the amount and the number of investments. One of the questions I get a lot is like, wait, but what's happening? Are they, is there real innovation? Are there innovative companies that, out of these 100 companies that you have at AstroLabs, are any of them doing something like, really innovative? So I've thought a lot about that, and I think the answer is yes. There are some that are quite, that have what I'd call business model innovation, right? But I think the more interesting point is that there's this whole other thing that I'd like to call, like, let's say, execution innovation, right? Which is much more complex than it seems at the surface. So you look at a business model, let's say e-commerce, which on the surface, I'm just doing a X of the Middle East, right? I'm taking an Amazon model and copying and pasting it to the Middle East. The reality is when you actually look at a couple of layers down, what's happening, what the challenges are of starting a company like that, is that there's quite a bit of innovation that needs to happen. I know from our own experience from Nemshi times, I'll give you one concrete example. After an order is placed, and you've packaged it up and you've sent it out, right? So you just sent it with a courier. In the US, basically, the e-commerce job, the company's job is basically done at that point. You have really good logistics providers that kind of close that loop and get it done. In our region, that's kind of where a lot of the headaches begin because 80% of the orders are cash. So you actually didn't make revenue until it got delivered. A lot of the shipping and logistics is not good, so you actually have to figure out ways to be able to, proactively track it and deal with that challenge. So if you aren't addressing those specific issues, actually that can lead to the utter failure of the company, and that's happened to some of the e-commerce companies because it looks like at the surface it's just e-commerce. But if you didn't innovate, figure out whitelist for customers and blacklist, so you're not sending out orders to people who aren't going to pay, and these types of things that don't really exist in the more developed markets, then you kind of won't be able to succeed. So that's one example, but there is this. There is also a logic to having more companies that are applying existing business models to the region. I think investors are interested in that because they know at the surface, at least, this model can work. And the risk is, can this team implement or can this team execute this model? Versus, I have no idea if this model even can work. And this market is really fragmented and small and difficult and regulatory and all these types of other challenges that you face, right? So that's why when somebody asks about innovation, is there innovation in the GCC or innovation in MENA? It's like, yeah, there is some, but I mean honestly, there's a lot more than it looks like at the surface. Is the summary to this slide, and each one of the companies that we see is innovating in its own way. I'll say a couple points about kind of government support and the way that the governments can engage in order to facilitate this whole growth and what's happening. I think there's two ways of engaging, and one much more useful, successful, and beneficial than another. I'll talk about the useful one that we've seen both in the UAE and in Saudi. which is a kind of a regulatory and facilitating approach. And what we've seen now in the UAE, and you want to come to AstroLabs, we have a partnership with the DMCC, the largest free zone. We can enable that licensing, setup, visas, everything within a short span of time. It's not 24 hours. It's not 24 hours, and it's not quite as cheap as the UK. But the fact is, it works, and it's reliable, and you can make it happen. And it's a tax-free environment, so it has some benefits over the UK. And you can locate global talent within a couple of weeks, getting visas from basically anywhere in the world, right? Which is another benefit over a US or a European market. So there are benefits. Now, interestingly, that has opened up in Saudi. So we're actually the first foreign incubator licensed by SAGIA to enable SMEs to enter into Saudi on a fully foreign-owned entity, and then be able to do business as a local company, which is even more powerful than the UAE, which is a free zone company, correct? So this is an onshore entity that you'd be able to get, and actually AstroLabs is a SAGIA licensed entity, and so that whole enablement, that's a great example of how government can be very proactive in supporting companies to get set up. It's less effective when governments go ahead and try to actually implement things themselves in order to build the ecosystem by either doing investing or setting up spaces and doing all these types of running things basically as government. And there's an entire literature about this if you're interested. It's a Boulevard of Broken Dreams, like why public initiatives to boost entrepreneurship fail. And it's not a MENA thing. It's not a GCC thing. It's actually a global thing. That the vast majority of these types of efforts, although well-meaning, end up having an opposite impact for multiple reasons. It's by Josh Lerner. It's a good book if you're interested in the topic. I'll wrap by talking about like the next wave and what we're seeing coming up. One of the things that I did want to bring up is the opening of Saudi, which I just had mentioned. I think that's going to have a substantial impact. When we've been doing training in Saudi for the last 5 years, and we've seen that there's a biggest differential, or the biggest gap between just raw potential and talent and people who want to do stuff, and then the resources and the services basically available for them, especially when you compare to other markets. So there is an untapped potential that's there, and we hope to play a role in that, along with many other players. There's the challenge is attracting actually top talent into the sector. So pulling them out of like an oil and gas job or a finance job and really trying to get them into something, or a government job for that matter, and making this sector something more interesting to them. And I think that will come as we have a couple more big success stories. Whether it's an exit of Careem or some other large companies forming, especially ones that have a distributed ownership, right? So where the employees get equity, wealth is generated by a broad range of people, and then you can look at your peers and say, oh wow, my peer that just started at Careem was able to be so successful in the short span of time. Maybe I should think about jumping into this sector, right? And I think we're seeing one of the things I expect to see is e-commerce growth as all of the pipes are made cleaner, clearer. So everything from the logistics to the payments to all the challenges that are faced by e-commerce are solved, and more like large players come into the market. The region's percentage of e-commerce as a percent of total retail is like one of the lowest in the world. Here in the UK, it's about a third. Over in our region, it's like low single-digit percent. So there's a huge potential for growth there, and we expect to see a lot more of that. So, and then emerging GCC, like places like Kuwait, are actually we're seeing more and more activity. But as of right now, it's basically the name of the game is UAE and Saudi. And a lot more excitement to come. So thanks for taking the time to listen.